I want to turn now, though, to another big story that we continue to follow on this program. Mexico and Canada have come to an agreement that will see Mexico resume sending migrant workers to this country. Last week, Mexico hit pause on sending workers to Canada because of COVID-19 outbreaks at more than a dozen farms in this country. 3 migrant workers have died from COVID-19 in Ontario. Canadian farmers rely on 60,000 short-term foreign workers, predominantly from Latin America and the Caribbean, to plant and harvest crops. Juan José Gómez Camacho is Mexico's ambassador to Canada. He joins me now to discuss the agreement. Hello, Ambassador. Good to see you again.
Vajiko, good to see you too. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yourself?
All good. Happy to be with you.
Good to hear it. We're happy to have you with us. I want to start off on the subject of the agreement here regarding temporary foreign workers. How confident are you, given everything that's transpired over the last number of weeks, that Mexican workers who come to this country to work on these farms are going to be safe?
I'm very confident with the commitment that we have had from the Canadian authorities, from the Prime Minister down to the Ministers of Agriculture, the Minister of Labour, whom we've been in close contact. That is first very clear to us. Number two, they all have been, I have to say, very forthcoming. This that has been often referred to as a negotiation between the two countries, I should characterize it differently. Both of us have come together, put our heads together to see how we can strengthen the protection for these workers, how can we improve, and the government can improve their conditions, and how can the authorities mitigate even further the risks that obviously are there because of the pandemics, and very much so the role of the farmers themselves. They are the ones that have to comply with the rules, they are the ones that have to comply with the policies, and they are the ones that have the workers. And they are the ones that need also the workers to make sure that not only they continue with their business, that the crops are safe, but overall, which is also very important and is a sort of realization during the pandemics, that these workers, 28,000 or so every year, play a fundamental role in the food production chain in Canada, as even the Prime Minister said at some point, is the food security of Canada. And that has to be recognized, and farmers, of course, have to act upon it or consistently with that.
What is it from your perspective that happened? Was it a failure of farmers to comply with the rules, or was it a failure of the government to properly enforce those rules?
I think it's a combination of factors. One, of course, relates to the capacity of the authorities to supervise their thousands of farms all over Canada, and is very challenging. And one of the core elements of our agreement announced last Friday is precisely on stepping up efforts for supervision and monitoring, and to do that not only in a virtual way, as you and I are now, but physically, to make sure that this is actually, they can actually check on the conditions. On the farmer side, yes, it's very clear that a number of the farms are not complying with the rules, especially in terms of the housing conditions. Workers are in overcrowding conditions, and that not only is not okay under any circumstance, they are here, they have to be treated properly, but within the context of the pandemics, is just a recipe for infection. So yes, there is a problem. We have been listening to what Premier Ford has been saying even half an hour ago, and that just proves the point that farmers really have to do much, much better. This is not to say that they all are behaving the same way. A great number of them are being very responsible, very committed, and really doing the best they can with the workers, but others are not, and this is precisely why we had outbreaks and sadly 3 fatalities.
Yeah, and those fatalities, the latest one is a 55-year-old. His name is Juan Lopez Chaparro. You mentioned the other. There are still a number of outbreaks in southwestern Ontario. If your government is to see continue, hopefully not, of course, but if there are additional deaths or if outbreaks continue to rise, are you prepared to suspend sending those workers here again?
What we are doing now is monitoring very carefully to which farms workers would go or which farms are requesting workers. And we will send workers to each farm insofar it is very clear that they are free, of course, from outbreaks and that they are properly implementing the rules. If there are farms that don't do that, of course, workers will go to others that follow the rules. But those that are not, of course, we will not put at risk Mexican workers.
But are you prepared, I guess, to suspend the program in full as you did a week ago, or now you feel like you have a system?
Now we have in place. No, we will not do that. We have now very not only the commitments that I was mentioning and the policies, etc., decided by the Canadian authorities last Friday, but also we have now a sort of task force, which is a very important component, integrated by both governments. On the Canadian side, you will see agriculture, health, immigration, labor, customs, and on the Mexican side, the same, including the embassy and our consulates. And this sort of task force will be on call constantly to make sure that as soon as there is a complaint, as soon as there is a suspicion or of some improper conditions or outbreaks or a Mexican not being in the right situation, this group will immediately act. The Canadian authorities will immediately act in an agile way, will act to address the issues. We understand these things may happen. What we don't understand and we will not accept is specific cases of farms that simply are not following the rules.
I want to ask you a question before I let you go about the spread of the virus in your country, in your home country, Mexico. It's currently only testing at a rate that's 27 times lower than this country. Mexico has recorded more than 180,000 cases, more than 21,000 deaths. That's the 7th highest number of deaths in the world. The president of Mexico says that your country has, quote, tamed the pandemic. Is that really true?
Well, first, when we are characterized as one of the biggest cases of infection and deaths, you have to factor that in with the size of the population. The size of the population is 130 million, and when you factor that per population, the numbers come much lower. What the government put in place, which is working fairly well or very well, is a sort of lighting system, like a traffic light system, where each state of the country, the 32, every X number of days, is revising the light, the color of the light, from red to green and to more in between. And each of these lights enforce, suppose or determine the rules that should be applied. Most of the country remains in red. Most of the country remains locked down and in isolation. Some states are starting to open up. Some sectors determined as essential, as here in Canada, are already back to work, but under very strict rules. And the Mexican people have been very cooperative on this.
Yeah, I guess my question is around the characterization by the president of taming the pandemic. And I take your point on the testing per capita, or sorry, the results per capita. But my understanding is that the rate at which you are testing is very low compared to some other countries, and that there are some concerns, for example, from healthcare workers about that rate of testing, or even having some of them to pay for their own antibody testing after the fact. And I just wonder if there are efforts underway or to increase the amount of testing done, and whether there's an acknowledgement that that's the case.
There are, well, first, there is an acknowledgement, as is happening in many places, that there is a number of infections that are not being registered by the system, precisely because not only of the test testing numbers or testing capacities, but because, for example, there are asymptomatic cases or people that get infection and simply go through it, which is 80-90% of the population, or rather of the infected people. That is for sure. So the number of infections in Mexico, as again elsewhere, has to be multiplied for a certain factor, and that has been varying, and the government has been very forthcoming in explaining that. Number two, each state is making efforts according to each state's circumstances to scale up the testing, and the federal government is making efforts, very important efforts, to keep making sure that the health infrastructure, hospitals, beds, intensive care units, ventilators are available. And so far in the country, despite the important numbers, as you have mentioned, no hospital has been entered in any sort of crisis in the sense of capacity of the hospitals. They all are at 80%, 90%, some 70%. So in that sense, the hospitals' activity and occupation also shows the real rate of the pandemics in the country. So it's a very big challenge. The country is being very responsible. There are very strict rules on how to open up, when and where, and is very much, I don't know if the term is under control, but certainly the government is on top of it.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I appreciate your time this evening.
Pleasure to be with you as always.
They never stop working, but nonetheless, the government has released a back-to-work plan for public servants. In March, most of the country's 250,000 federal employees were sent home after the pandemic was declared. Now, though, as the provinces continue to lift COVID-19 restrictions, some of them will return to offices. Many will continue to work remotely, however, on a permanent basis. So what does that mean for Canadians and the services that they rely on? Jean-Yves Duclos is the president of the Treasury Board. He joins me from the foyer of the House of Commons. Hi, Minister Duclos. Good to see you again.
Hello, Vashi. Nice to see you too.
Minister, I have a number of questions about a possible return to work for public servants, but I'd like to first start off and ask you about something you took some questions on earlier along with the Prime Minister, and that is the death of a third migrant worker, 55-year-old Juan Lopez Chaparro. Why didn't your government do more, or what level of responsibility does your government bear for the number of outbreaks that we have seen on these farms?
Well, this is indeed a very sad story, and we are, of course, our thoughts and prayers are for the family, unfortunately the family who stayed in Mexico and the friends of the person that died. We all bear a level of responsibility. It's a collective responsibility. We did impose some strict conditions on foreign workers when they come to Canada, so they could isolate and protect their health, quarantine, but then there obviously was something wrong afterwards which failed to protect their health. So we have a share of the responsibility. We are going to work with the province, with the local community, with the employer to understand exactly what happened and how we can avoid those things in the future.
You noted just now that just to a degree, and the Prime Minister said this earlier, obviously those rules were not followed in that area. And I'm wondering why federal inspections didn't pick that up. More than 500 were conducted since the outset of the pandemic. But no farms, no employers were found to be in non-compliance. Nobody was found to have broken the rules. Where did the system fail?
Well, the system did fail somewhere, you're right. Now, we understand the challenges that there are in working in a largely virtual environment with physical distancing and all sorts of impediments to traveling from one place to another. But there obviously were rules that were not followed, assistance that was not provided, and we need to find out exactly how and why, and to make sure that these things don't occur again.
What does it say that the inspections didn't figure that out?
Well, it's obviously a mixture of different things. An inspection is certainly one of the areas where an error was made. So why did we not catch this earlier? So it's absolutely essential for the memory of that person and to make sure that other workers are better protected when they come to Canada to help our farmers and to help feed Canadians.
To that end, Minister, you are president of the Treasury Board. What kind of resources is the federal government prepared to put to this endeavor that you just described?
Well, we did increase quite significantly the level of resources over the last few weeks for good reasons, obviously, because we were in a crisis, in the health crisis, and protecting the health of everyone, including non-Canadians, was essential. But obviously, there is more to do. And in trying exactly what the federal government should do, we need to figure out better what happened to that worker, but also to those 3 workers who died during the crisis.
Respectfully, that doesn't answer my question. I know that you put resources up at the front, $1,500 per worker. So I think it was $50 million for those quarantining efforts. Clearly, that did not stop the spread of this virus among migrant worker communities. How much more money is the federal government prepared to put to that?
So you're correct. Now, we did put $1,500 per worker, making sure that the farmers and the communities had enough resources to welcome and to protect the health of those foreign workers. But that obviously wasn't enough, because after the quarantine of those workers, there obviously were things that went wrong. Now, the obvious need now, as we've said earlier, is to find out exactly what happened, the level of responsibility that the federal government has to bear and it has to admit, but also the collective responsibility that possibly belong to other agents and other governments.
I just want our audience to be clear, though, Minister. Is your government, if it needs to, prepared to spend more money on this?
Yes, we will certainly do that, because that's part of federal responsibility. In fact, it's part of Canada's responsibility to those workers.
Okay, on the subject of public servants, I read your statement about returning to work. When is the earliest, from your perspective, that public servants will physically be returning to work? I know it's not all going to happen at once, but what's the earliest point you see that happening?
Well, before I answer this important question, let me say 2 things. The first important word is thank you, because I, as President of the Treasury Board, as member of the Cabinet, I have seen the amazing efforts that public service have made in the last few weeks in sometimes difficult personal and professional circumstances. The second thing that I must stress is that we're not talking about civil servants going back to work, because they have been working
physically,
back,
I said, yeah.
That's right, back to the office,
Yes.
to the physical office, as opposed to back to work, because many public servants have worked harder and in more difficult circumstances than prior to the crisis. But we're talking about a gradual return to the office, always keeping in mind the top priority, which is to protect the health and the safety of those workers. That's the absolute priority. But as we are mindful of, there are in many parts of Canada a level of deconfinement and local public health advice which allows a gradual return to the office. And that's why we need to do this. And in fact, it will be good for everyone, because it will make work more flexible and in some cases more efficient too. Because we recognize that a lot of work can be done at home, but some work sometimes requires physical presence, and that's why we need to be focused on that as well.
What's the earliest that could happen?
Well, it could be as soon as in the next few weeks. It's of course going to depend on the local circumstances, the local work responsibilities of individuals, depending on where they work, in which part of the country, and the local public health advice, but also on exactly what type of work they do. Did they work for National Defence, or for Parks Canada, or for the Canada Revenue Agency? Public servants are not the same. No, they're different people, but also work in different places, and they have different responsibilities. So it all depends on individuals as well as on agencies and departments.
Before I let you go, Minister, I do want to ask you about a video that the Public Service Commission of Canada tweeted out this weekend on the occasion of Public Service Week, celebrating that. All the characters in the video were white. It's been taken down, the video, and an apology was posted. Does it send the wrong message, though, to Black and Indigenous public servants?
Well, indeed, I think it does send not only a wrong message, but also a wrong description of what the public service is now and what we want it to be in the future. I have a personal mandate from the Prime Minister to work with others to increase the diversity of the public service in Canada, to be a better representation of what Canada and Canadians are. It will make our public service more inclusive, but it will also make it more effective at serving Canadians.
That certainly sounds good, but Minister, you know, if I look at some of the numbers, that isn't the case right now. The most senior civil servants, deputy and associate deputy ministers, the number of them coming from diverse backgrounds is still less than 10% of the total. It's so low that the Privy Council office wouldn't even release the figure to us, arguing that it would compromise privacy rights because it would be easy to work out who those senior civil servants are. What does that say about your government's efforts to better reflect the diverse nature of this country?
Well, that is correct. Although we've made some significant progress in the last few years, there is, as you correctly say, a lot more to do, in particular at the higher level of the public service, where diversity is not only less present, but more important to have. So we need diversity, inclusion, the ability of everyone to prosper and to contribute to Canada at all levels of the public service. And that's exactly what we will continue to do.
Is there a specific target, though, by which we can then hold you accountable a few years from now and say, you know, Minister, government, you didn't reach the target that you set out? Because otherwise, my concern is that you're saying the right things, but, you know, a lot of people will feel as though the action doesn't back it up.
Well, you're right. Now, there are two things, the backward-looking and the forward-looking agenda. The backward-looking agenda is fairly positive, not perfect, but fairly positive. We've increased diversity at many different levels, including on the nominations, we call the Governing Council nominations, whose numbers, diversity numbers, have doubled in the last few years. But forward-looking, you're right. Now, we want that progress to continue. I'm working with the unions. I'm working with my colleagues. I'm working with members of parliament who have civil servants in their ridings to make sure that, as you said, we are able to be transparent as well as effective. Now, I cannot quote to you targets at this particular time, but I hope to come back to you whenever you invite me later to be a bit more precise.
Okay, I look forward to that. Thank you, Minister Duclos. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.